This week I'd like to review the Companion Bible, which was edited largely by Ethelbert W. Bullinger. The book is 9 3/4 inches tall, 6 3/4 inches wide, and 1 3/4 inches thick. We'll compare it to a couple of other dispensationalist Bibles in a second. Here's the box. You can pause and read that if you like. Simple box that drops. Two-piece box with a top that drops over the bottom. My copy is thumb indexed, as you saw there. I have here a church Bible publishers, local church Bible publishers, original Scofield. So this is the 1917 Scofield, not actually the original, but the second edition. First edition came out in 1909. And as you can see, the Companion Bible's considerably larger than the 1917 Scofield. This is the 1967 Scofield. My copy here is a 40th anniversary edition, so this one was printed in 2007. And again, as you can see, it's a bit larger than the 1967 Scofield. Let's look at the format. It's a single column of text. Sometimes it's 2 columns of text, though, because if the text column is longer than the notes, then the text will extend over here in kind of an L-shaped. You have a reverse L of notes on this page. So this is the text column. The text column is 60 millimeters wide, and there are about 47 characters per line, and you can get as many as 71 lines per page. The page dimensions are 236 millimeters tall, that's 9.3 inches. 159 millimeters wide, 6.26 inches. As you can see, the print is dark and bold. It's not line matched, but the paper is fairly opaque, so I don't think that's a problem. Margins at the top, I measured that to be 19 to 21 millimeters. Outer margin from this line out is 18 to 19 millimeters. At the bottom, it's 26 to 28 millimeters, and the inner, at the edges in Genesis and Revelation, can be as much as about 18 millimeters. As you can see, the text and the notes are enclosed in a rectangular box. The font in the text, I measure the uppercase letters to be the equivalent roughly of a 7.75 point Times New Roman, whereas the lowercase letters are proportionately a bit larger. They're about 8 points. Line height is 2.53 millimeters. That's 7.2 points. So the line height is a little tight for the character size. And it isn't very hard to find spots here. One I just saw, turning to this page at random without any prior planning, where the uppercase or the ascender on the F and the descender on the J pretty much intersect. So a little bit tight in terms of line spacing. Verse numbers, it's verse by verse, but the verses are separated by a space to indicate paragraphs. So the verse numbers are on the left hand side of the verses. Words added by the translators are in italic font. Here are some. Therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace. The it is and it might be were supplied by the translators to make the text read more smoothly. Pronouns emphasized in the original are in blackletter text. Let's see if we see any of those on these pages. I know where I can find them easily, and that's by looking in Genesis. And let's see, oh, here we go. Genesis 1:22, he blessed them. So that's what that refers to in terms of pronouns emphasized by blackletter text. If the original language actually includes a specific pronoun, if it's emphasized there, then you'll see blackletter text. Now there are notes in the right-hand column, and these notes are in a font that's about 7 points tall. It's a bit smaller than the font in the text. Again, the column width is 60 millimeters, so it's 60 millimeters across the text column and 60 millimeters across the notes column. The paper is fairly thick. It's 35.4 microns thick, so I estimate the paper weight at 32 GSM. There's only a very light sheen, and you probably can't see it in this light, but there's a very light sheen to the paper. It's not quite as matte as it could be. It's white paper with a slight yellow tinge to it, and there is only moderate show-through. So you can see print behind the letters, but these letters are printed so boldly that that noise created by images on the opposite side of the page in the following page doesn't cause that much trouble. At least it doesn't cause difficulty for my brain. There is not any print non-uniformity. I did not notice any. There are book introductions for some books. For instance, here's the introduction to Philippians, and the font here is about a 7-point font, and the column is 122 millimeters wide with about 115 characters per line. Book titles, we'll go to a typical page of text. Book titles are in the center top. Page contents are indicated here, so chapter 1 verse 27 is the first verse on the page, and chapter 2 verse 8 is the last verse on this page. Page numbers are at the center bottom of the page. There are no headings in the text at all. We'll talk a bit about these, what the editors call structures in the side, that if you look at the structures that are in the notes, you can kind of tell what the contents are, but there are no really useful headings in the text. Chapter numbers span about 2 lines of text, and they're large and bold, as you see. Books generally begin on a separate page, although 3rd John is an exception. Show you that. So here's 2nd John. 2nd John has an introduction to it, and then 2nd John is on a separate page. 3rd John actually begins on the same page. But apart from that, it appears that all the books of the Bible begin on their own pages. Happily, from my perspective, if you like red letters, that's great. I do not like red letters because I find them difficult on my eyes, and they're also, it seems, difficult to be printed clearly, crisply, and with even darkness. So I'm glad not to have red letters myself, and the words of Christ here are in black. Quotations from the Old Testament are in a bold print. So a good place to find those easily would be Romans. Look anywhere in Romans, you can find quotations from the Old Testament. They're printed in bold print. Also in the Old Testament, a passage that is then quoted later in the New Testament will turn up in bold. So let's just go here to one of the early Psalms, which is commonly quoted. Here's Psalm 22. And so Psalm 22 is quoted in the New Testament, and it appears in a bold font here in the Old. In the margins, in addition to these, what they call structures, you occasionally see dates. So here you see 4004. That's Archbishop Usher's date. For Usher, that's the date of the creation of the world. Since the Companion Bible endorses the gap theory, that's the date for the restoration of the world. There are 198 appendices, and this is the real meat of this Bible. We'll look at the notes a bit, and we'll see that the notes actually are largely textual in nature and do not tell us very much doctrinal. But the appendices, of which there are 198, span 227 pages. They're mostly in a 2-column format, as here. They are in a 7-point font. At the end of those 227 pages, if you're interested in finding what the appendices say on a particular topic, then there's a general appendix to the appendices. And so there's a good chance that you'll find, by looking here, where to look in the appendix to find the information that you're interested in. So if you're interested in what the Companion Bible has to say on the formula of baptism, you look at 185, appendix number 185, which is on page 206, and so forth. And so this general index is 7 pages long, maybe 6.5. There are, after that, there are 14 blank pages, 7 blank sheets that you could write notes on. This is the 7th and last one. And a couple of pages of glossy cardstock, a less glossy page, and you're at the paste-down binding of this bonded leather Bible. There are no color maps in the back. There is a black and white map at Appendix 179A. There are a couple of other maps in the appendices as well, but you have a map of Paul's missionary journeys. His missionary journeys here at 179A. It is a sewn binding. We looked at the paste-down construction, but it's definitely sewn. It's a bonded leather cover on my copy. Since it's sewn, it does lie open, and in this case, it lies fairly flat. So there's no drop off to the gutter here or here. Inner margins are fairly large too, so that even when you get to the center of the page, the text is out here in the area where it remains rather flat. It's not curving much in the center, which is very good for people with older eyes. They have magnifying lenses which have a shallow field of view, depth of focus, and so it's good for them to keep the text flat. That's my concern about the Cambridge Topaz, by the way, based on what I've seen. If it's an edge-line construction, it could be stiff, like in the Cambridge Concord, which would mean that the text would tend to be curving on the left-hand edge. They have references in the outer margin. I wish they'd put them in the inner margin to leave the text out on the flat area. But time will tell. We'll see how they actually work it. It may be much better than I'm thinking right now. Okay, back to this Bible. Editorial comment aside. We have one burgundy ribbon marker. It's shiny on both sides. Ribbon marker is 6 millimeters wide. It's 318 millimeters long. So it's definitely long enough to be able to grab with your thumb at the corner of the book. In the front of the Bible, there's a presentation page, and then another page, I suppose, in which you could write family information, both on glossy paper. So I would write and then let the ink dry before I did anything with it. 6 blank pages here, so 3 blank sheets at the beginning. Then we get to the first title page and second title page. Kriegel Publications, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Authorized version of 1611 with the structures. We'll talk about the structures a bit. It was released in 6 parts beginning in 1910. It uses E.W. Bullinger's notes throughout the text. And so they have a disclaimer here about how it may be sometimes difficult to read. I haven't seen any difficulties myself, haven't experienced any. And here are the ISBNs for various editions. I bought mine in 2009. It's a 2007 printing, and it's the 15th printing. It's printed in China. So you have a table of contents here. So Revelation begins on page 1883. And then we have a preface. It's a 7-page preface. It's in 10 to 10.5 point font, rather large and bold. The text in this Bible is based on, they say here, I think, text is that of the authorized version of 1611 as published by the revisers in their parallel Bible in 1886. It is not a pure Cambridge edition, I checked. I have here a copy of Charles C. Ryrie's book, Dispensationalism. He has a chapter on what he calls Ultradispensationalism, which mentions our editor, Ethelbert W. Bullinger. It says that he was an ordained Anglican clergyman, author of 77 works, including the Companion Bible, calls him a scholar of repute. He edited for 19 years Things to Come, and was apparently a musician as well. To give you a sense for the man's life, I prepared this chart. As you can see, he was born in Canterbury, England. He worked as a clergyman for the Church of England until 1888. I'm hopeful that his views, his distinctive ultra-dispensationalist views, were developed after that point, because they're not very fitting with the Anglican theology. His work as editor of the monthly journal Things to Come was from 1894 to his death in 1913, and he was principal editor of the Companion Bible, which was published in 6 parts. The complete work was published clearly after he died in London in 1913. To continue briefly with Ryrie on Bullinger, he says that he held the heretical doctrine of the extinction of the soul between death and resurrection, silent on the final state of the lost, and many of his followers were and are annihilationists. In his sevenfold dispensationalist scheme, Bullinger had 2 dispensations between Pentecost and the end of the church age, rather than 1, as was normal. He placed the Gospels and the book of Acts under the law, and commenced the dispensation of the church with the ministry of Paul after Acts 28. So, Book of Acts is not actually in the church dispensation, according to Bullinger. The prison epistles, therefore, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, set forth the fullness of the revelation of the mystery of this church age. And this is pertinent to my point about the Church of England earlier. He also denied that water baptism and the Lord's Supper are for this age. And he says he was the font of all ultra-dispensationalist teachings from his day to the present. So with that little bit of background, we'll see how much of that we can find in the appendices. So we'll begin by taking a quick look through the appendices. With Appendix 11, we see a denial of the day-year theory, which is popular amongst historicist interpreters. Appendix 12 teaches that the gospel is taught in the stars. We go to Appendix 19. We find an article about the serpent of Genesis, and the way I read that, he denies that Satan was a literal serpent in the Garden of Eden. 23 talks about the sons of God in Genesis 6, 2, and 4, and he teaches that they are fallen angels. In appendix number 63, what do we find here? Appendix 63, the book of Psalms. It's kind of interesting that he has a section on the changes in the Psalms in the Prayer Book, which I think would only be really of interest to Anglicans, and yet it's here in this dispensationalist Bible. We go over to appendix number 72. He talks about something that's a common topic for dispensationalism, that the present age is a parenthesis. We go over to appendix 91. Here, 91 is on the 70 weeks of Daniel 9. I should point out here that this is the discussion of Daniel 9, 24 through 27, and that he shows that the first group of weeks ends in 29 AD, but then the last group of 7 years, the 1-7 here, 1260 days or 42 months, is at the end, separated by a long length of time. This again is just common dispensationalist teaching, and he denies here that the Messiah is the subject of the covenant, the one who makes the covenant rather, so it has to be someone else. awaits its fulfillment, which would be at the end of time, and the coming prince is the false Messiah or Antichrist. Bullinger would not appear to have been a King James onlyist. Here he talks in Appendix 94, Section 7, about the modern critical texts, and he does so in a way that seems to me to be not unfavorable to them. He says that in his notes he gives the combined judgment of 6 of the above editors, and he names them. These are all 19th editors of the Greek New Testament, and points out the agreement or disagreement of the Syriac version therewith. The Syriac version is how he refers to the majority text, or the Byzantine text form. Appendix 113 points out that the kingdom and the church cannot be identified, and he points out that the kingdom is one great subject to prophecy, whereas the church is not the subject of prophecy, but on the contrary was kept secret and hidden in God until the time came for the secret to be revealed. And this is the church described in the prison epistles, not the church of the book of Acts, as he will point out elsewhere. With regard to the question of soul sleep, there may be other things here, but just in my rapid skimming through the appendices, I found here in Appendix 131, where he's talking about the meaning of the word Sheol, which has traditionally been translated as hell. He argues that the grave, therefore, is obviously the best rendering, meaning the state of death. Appendix 140, which is where we are here, is entitled The Gospel of the Kingdom and Other Gospels. It talks about the everlasting gospel, the gospel of the kingdom, and mentions the parables of the sower and the marriage feast and the great supper in that regard. Then another gospel is called the gospel or good news of God. This is the gospel unto which Paul the apostle was separated, and is supplementary to the gospel of kingdom, of which it was another aspect. So this is the gospel of a risen Messiah, reproclaimed as about to come and restore all things. And it was the burden of apostolic proclamation during the dispensation of the Acts. And the next gospel is the gospel of the grace of God, and it was not new. It was promised before and written down by his prophets, and it has to do with repentance. And it is distinguished from that which has not been before revealed by the prophets in the concluding verses of Romans. The time had come for this secret to be revealed and to be committed to the prophetic writings. This revelation is contained in the 3 epistles written by Paul from his prison in Rome to the Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. Thus the gospel of the kingdom was a proclamation by and concerning the Messiah made by John the Baptist and himself, and is the subject of the 4 gospels. The gospel of God is the proclamation concerning the same Messiah made by the 12, the Apostle Paul, and them that heard the Lord during the dispensation of the Acts, and is the subject of their testimony in their writings in the earlier epistles of Paul. Seeing it was good news sent after the resurrection of Christ, it is all of pure grace and favor, and hence is the gospel of the grace of God. Then the gospel of the glory of Christ, he says, is the gospel that is revealed fully in the prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. So it's really quite complicated. Now in appendix number 155, he has a very interesting interpretation of Mark 13:30, which I think says in the King James something like, "This generation shall by no means pass until all these things be done." And Bullinger translates the second part of that with a subjunctive, "till all these things may be fulfilled." And in these paragraphs, he seems to imply that that allows the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of this prophecy to be up to the obedience of the nation. He concludes saying, had the nation repented, then Jesus would have been sent, and the restoration of all things would have begun and taken place in accordance with God's divine assurance. But the condition of national repentance was not fulfilled, hence that generation passed away, and both prophecies are now postponed. In Appendix 146, he kind of hints at the gap theory. He says that the disruption of the world is an event forming a great dividing line in the dispensations of the ages. In Genesis 1:1, we have the founding of the world, but in Genesis 1:2, we have its overthrow. In Appendix 156, he says that the day before the Passover, the 14th of Nisan, or Preparation Day, the day of the crucifixion, was our Tuesday sunset to Wednesday sunset. And just in case there's any doubt about what he means, go down here, we see that Jesus is buried in haste before sunset, our Wednesday, about 6 p.m., so he believed that the crucifixion occurred on a Wednesday and not on a Friday. Appendix 168 is on the last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel, and the explanation for how those came into doubt is given in this paragraph. In Bullinger's view, when transcribers came to the last 12 verses of Mark and they saw no trace of such spiritual gifts in existence, they concluded that there must be something doubtful about the genuineness of these verses, and they may have marked them as doubtful or as spurious, which led to their omission. Even more interesting to me, though, is this section of the previous paragraph, where he says that for nearly 100 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, there is a complete blank in the ecclesiastical history and a complete silence of Christian speakers and writers. Then the footnote says, well, it's not actually complete. It mentions the Didache, but it talks about how it shows the corruption of Christianity, how quickly it had set in. And apparently they know nothing about the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. So to continue, so far from the churches of the present day being the continuation of apostolic times, organized religion as we see it today was the work of a subsequent and quite an independent generation. And that is kind of a dispensationalist, early 19th century dispensationalist way of looking at things, but it's not the view that one would expect of a vicar in the Church of England. Appendix 181, Section 6 is where we're looking now, and this reinforces the notion that the church did not begin at Pentecost. He says, during the Acts period, believers were guided into much truth in advance of what had previously been revealed. They were instructed into much that they had been unable to bear before the coming of the Holy Spirit to instruct them, but not even yet had they been guided into all the truth. This was reserved, all the truth was reserved, and not permitted to be revealed until after the public proclaiming of the kingdom had ended, after the close of Acts. Then it was at the commencement of this present interim period, during which blindness in part has happened to Israel, that the church, which is his body, began to be formed, to the praise of the glory of his grace. So the church was not being formed in the book of Acts. As stated above, and as the facts show, this church did not begin at Pentecost, as is so commonly taught and believed. So what Ryrie said, at least in this point, about Bullinger is accurate. We will quickly take a close-up look at the font. Oh, by the way, I'm seeing several of these blackletter pronouns emphasized here. This is the original Scofield coming in on the right, as far as I can bring it. And it's pretty clear that the Companion Bible is a smaller font, but it's also darker. Line spacing, I think, is fairly tight in both of them. I'm not sure that the Companion Bible isn't actually a bit easier to read because of the boldness of the type, even though it's smaller. For completeness, we'll take a look at the notes as well. We're in Psalm 75, and you see these little O's. That indicates that there's a note over in the margin. So here with Psalm, if you look over here, title, Psalm, Hebrew, and Mizorm. So it's giving you the Hebrew name of it. Here's one for God. You look over here, it says Hebrew Elohim. and it tells you that you can find out more information in Appendix 4, Section I, or Roman numeral 1. Sometimes you'll see a numeral rather than an O, so let's find one. I think there's one down here. In verse 7 you see a 1. That points you back to verse 1 to find information on God. Here's one, a 4 on wicked. That points you back up to verse 4. So here's the word wicked. You go over to the margin for verse 4, and you see it gives you the Hebrew word. You have textual notes here. Thy name. See note on 20.1. It denotes God's saving presence, and it tells you a textual variant here that's in the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Vulgate. They read, and we shall call on thy name. So you don't have much in the way of doctrinal notes here. In fact, I believe the introduction says that they try to avoid them, but instead you have information about the meaning of the words in the text and the meaning of the text. Now, while we're here, let's just mention these structures. I personally don't find them very useful, but this D corresponds to this D here. He says that the overall structure of Psalm 75 is praise, judgment, praise, judgment. And you see the D, you see the Q, there's the Q, here's an R, but the R has an S beside it. Well, the explanation for that is that he breaks down verses 2 through 8 with a separate structure that goes RS, T, R, slant S, or italic S, italic T. So RS goes with verses 2 and 3, and then R slant S goes with this last section of verse 3, which he says corresponds to the earth again. So, I'd like to sum up at this point. Don't know that I actually showed you the thumb indexes, but they seem like they're fairly good quality. They don't appear to be about to fall out at all, so I think they're sturdy enough. One thing you may have noticed about my copy is a crimping in the gutter, which causes the book to make quite a lot of noise when you flex it. This was common at the time I bought it, particularly in crossway Bibles, if I remember correctly. I think it's just sewn too tightly, or perhaps the holes are mislocated from one signature to another. It causes that crimping, which causes the noise from the page turns, but otherwise doesn't affect the functionality of the book. As I said, printed very nice and boldly. I'm not sure that it would be of much interest to anyone except to ultra-dispensationalists, people who are in one of those lines of dispensationalist descendants of Bullinger. Still, I think it's fairly well made, and I hope you enjoyed this tour of the Companion Bible. Thanks for watching. If you feel so inclined, remember to hit the subscribe button.